It was supposed to be a perfect vacation. A week away from the noise, the meetings, the predictable rhythms of suburban life. The house had been spotless when I left. The lawn neatly trimmed, the flower beds clean, my small vegetable garden carefully watered by the time sprinklers I'd just installed. I'd even taken photos before locking the door, proud of the quiet beauty my yard had finally become. When I pulled back into my driveway that Sunday afternoon, exhausted but happy, I expected to walk into the same peace I'd left behind. Instead, I froze at the curb. Everything was gone. The grass. My grass, emerald and soft, was shredded into clay. The flower beds, the ones I'd tended for years, had been gutted into bare holes. My small wooden fence lay in a pile by the road like debris. Even the young maple tree I'd planted the previous spring had been uprooted, its roots exposed, drying in the sun. For a moment I thought I had the wrong house. But the number on the mailbox didn't lie. Someone had torn through my yard. I got out of the car, numb. Fresh tire marks cut across the soil. Plastic trash bags and clumps of uprooted plants lay scattered everywhere. And then, stapled to my porch railing, I saw it, the notice. It was stamped in bold red letters across the top. Mandatory Aesthetic Improvement Initiative. Below it, the explanation. As part of community beautification efforts, your front yard has been professionally redesigned to meet uniform standards of presentation. I read it twice, barely breathing. Then again. They had done this. The HOA. While I'd been gone, the so-called Beautification Committee, an invention of our new HOA president, Nancy Pierce, had decided to overhaul non-compliant lots as part of her ambitious plan to make the neighborhood magazine ready. She'd been pushing for it for months, bragging about how her vision would raise property values. Her proposal had been rejected by homeowners at the last meeting. Apparently, she'd taken that as a challenge, not a decision. My yard wasn't ugly. It wasn't messy. It just wasn't hers. Those who knew Nancy described her as the kind of woman who never walked anywhere without a clipboard. Everything about her screamed control. She inspected driveways for texture inconsistencies, complained that porch lights were too warm in hue, and once fined a family because their Halloween decorations distracted from seasonal uniformity. But this was beyond anything she had done. This wasn't enforcement. This was intrusion. The anger came slow at first, buried under disbelief. I walked the length of the property, noting every change, every professional touch they'd forced onto my home. Perfectly mulched flower borders replaced my vegetables. Cheap shrubs now lined the walkway in aggressive symmetry. They'd installed solar lights so bright they looked like runway markers. The yard looked like a copy of every other house. Soulless. I spotted their logo on one of the small plastic tags stuck in the new soil, Premier Green Landscaping, the company Nancy had mentioned once as her preferred vendor. She had hired them using HOA funds to turn individuality into conformity. And me? I wasn't even consulted. Standing there, watching the wind scatter the last of my uprooted garden, the anger finally anchored itself. I didn't yell. I didn't call her. I just looked around at what was supposed to be my sanctuary and saw someone else's order carved into it. That evening, I sat on my porch steps as neighbors walked by slowly, their faces a mix of sympathy and fear. No one dared to speak up, not after seeing what Nancy had done to the one house that had voted against her last proposal. It wasn't a message. It was a warning. But she had misjudged me. She thought I'd accept it quietly the way others did, grumble, pay, move on. She didn't know that every photo, every receipt, every past HOA email sat archived neatly on my laptop. She didn't know how much time I'd spent understanding property law, reading HOA bylaws line by line. And she didn't know that the one project she had called a beautification initiative had just turned into evidence of unlawful entry, property damage, and misuse of association funds. As the lights from the new solar path flickered to life, sterile and harsh, I made a silent promise under the cold white glow. If Nancy wanted uniformity, I'd give her something every homeowner in Brookdale would soon share: the satisfaction of watching her empire crumble. The next morning, the wreckage in my yard looked worse in daylight. The once lively patch of earth where tomatoes and sweet basil had grown was now blanketed by commercial mulch, the kind that bleeds red dye when it rains. My tool shed looked out of place beside the pristine lines of Nancy's vision, a reminder of what had been before her beautification. The HOA had crossed into my life without permission. If they could destroy one yard, they could destroy every yard. That thought settled over me like frost. I didn't feel anger anymore. Not the kind that burned, but a colder one, sharp enough to carve patience into strategy. I began by printing off every HOA bylaw I could find. 27 pages in total, uploaded as PDFs on their portal, written in dull bureaucratic language designed to discourage curiosity. I read each clause until my eyes ached. The key came on page 14. Any changes to property aesthetics must be approved in writing by the homeowner unless the property is abandoned or the owner is unreachable after 30 days of verified attempts. Verified attempts. I hadn't missed a call. Not one email. No notice beyond the so-called initiative letter that arrived after the carnage. Legally, they had no standing. The HOA's actions weren't beautification. They were trespass. And that was only the start. I dug deeper into the association's finances, which, by law, were supposed to be publicly accessible to residents. Most homeowners never bothered to look. But late that night, in the quiet glow of my monitor, I discovered the ledger entries that would unravel Nancy's empire. The records were simple spreadsheets, date, description, amount, but two details stood out immediately. First, the landscaping contract. It was listed not as beautification initiative, but under emergency grounds maintenance. The cost? $14,870. Second, the vendor's signature. Premier Green Landscaping, the same company Nancy's husband happened to co-own under a subsidiary LLC registered only months before. I cross-referenced the vendor's registration address with public records. It matched Nancy's home address. It wasn't negligence. It was corruption. She hadn't just violated a property clause. She had used association funds to hire her own business under a false name. The money came directly from our community dues, the same payments she threatened residents over. Every beautified yard, every trimmed hedge, every stamped notice, all of it was financed by the people she bullied, then pocketed quietly into her own account. I printed the evidence. Every invoice, every email confirmation, every signature. Each sheet felt heavier than paper, thick with the weight of what it meant. By the second night, I had a folder labeled Project Expose. The next HOA board meeting was in 3 days. No one suspected what was coming. While others spent evenings mowing or watching the game, I spent mine tracing every rule she had broken. Unauthorized entry, misrepresentation of funds, failure to disclose a conflict of interest. According to state housing law, any one of those could warrant her removal from office. All of them together felony fraud. But I wanted more than her resignation. She had humiliated every homeowner who dared to speak up. She weaponized conformity and used community pride as her disguise. And now, in her attempt to standardize everything, she'd given me something uniform too. Support from a neighborhood finally disgusted enough to side together. Word spread faster than I expected. Someone must have noticed my digging. Other residents began calling, quietly at first, asking if the rumors about the invoices were true. When I confirmed, some offered screenshots of their emails with her. One woman admitted she'd been billed thousands for optional aesthetic enhancement. Another confessed Nancy sent private texts threatening to revisit her compliance status if she kept questioning charges. Each story added another nail into the coffin. By the night before the meeting, I had a full portfolio of proof, neatly organized and backed by witnesses willing to speak. While the rest of the community slept, I sat by my window, staring out at my ruined garden. The solar lights Nancy installed blinked lifelessly in uneven rhythm, like they knew their time was almost up. I imagined her face when she saw the paperwork, when she realized control was no longer hers to wield. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not out of revenge, but relief. The kind that comes when truth is finally louder than authority. When morning came, I clipped the folder shut and placed it neatly in my bag. The meeting would be in the clubhouse. I planned to sit quietly until my turn came, the homeowner who had simply endured and waited. Nancy had built her reputation on perfection and order. By tomorrow night, both would collapse. She called it beautification. I called it exposure. The clubhouse of Brookdale Estates was small but polished, the kind of place meant to impress outsiders rather than serve residents. Its walls gleamed with framed newsletters and aerial photos of the perfect community. Nancy Pierce always made sure the lights were set just right, the chairs evenly spaced, and the coffee perfectly brewed before her board meetings. Control wasn't just her habit, it was her identity. That evening, her sense of control was the first casualty. When I walked in, she was already there, standing at the front of the room beside her usual decorative clipboard, flashing her glossy smile to a nervous crowd. Next to her sat the board members, more like her entourage than officials. The air carried the tight politeness of people waiting for conflict they couldn't stop. "Tonight," she began, her tone sugary as ever, "we will be reaffirming our commitment to beautification, ensuring every property reflects the pride of Brookdale." Heads nodded quietly. No one dared interrupt her speech. I took a seat near the front, resting the thick folder on my lap, the one that held every piece of her deception. I let her talk, because I'd learned long ago that people like Nancy expose themselves best when they believe they're untouchable. She moved through her slides, before and after photos of lawns, their vibrant colors contrasting my torn-up yard projected on the screen as an example of improvement. I could feel neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. She'd turned my property into a spectacle. Perfect. When she opened the floor for comments, her expression changed slightly, like someone preparing to swat away mosquitoes. No one spoke at first. The silence thickened. Then I stood up. My voice came out steady, quiet, but it traveled through the room like a drawn line. The moment I laid the folder on the table before her, her smile faltered. I explained calmly that I had reviewed every section of the HOA bylaws, every financial statement, and every vendor record related to her so-called beautification initiative. I told the residents that what looked like improvement on paper was, in fact, property damage paid for with their fees. Murmurs spread across the room. I opened the folder. First, copies of the landscaping invoices, each one billed under emergency maintenance, bypassing homeowner consent. Then came the contract linking the payments directly to a business registered under Nancy's address. Gasps echoed when they saw her name printed in ink as co-owner. Behind me, phones went up, snapping photos documenting every line. The board members' hands trembled as they flipped through the papers. One of them whispered that they'd never seen these expenses approved. Nancy stammered excuses about clerical errors, administrative confusion, and subcontracting complications. But no amount of polished phrasing could hide what was already undeniable. Her face, once immovable, turned pale as I showed the emails, her threats, her private messages punishing dissenting residents, her signature approving payment cycles. She tried to seize the folder, but someone from the board stopped her. Too late. Every seat in that room was filled with witnesses who'd seen enough. The HOA accountant, a quiet man who rarely spoke, stood from the back, clearing his throat. He admitted he'd been pressured to process the invoices without signatures. Forced compliance, he called it. And now that he'd heard the full story, he wanted his statement recorded publicly. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector. And then, from the middle row, someone asked the question that sealed her fate. "Nancy, did you use our association dues for personal gain?" Her lips parted, but no words came. That silence did more damage than any accusation ever could. From there, the unraveling was rapid. A board member motioned for her immediate suspension pending investigation. Another proposed disclosing all financial statements to homeowners within 48 hours. The motion passed unanimously. Even the ones who used to shield her raised their hands. Then came the vote for emergency removal. One by one, each homeowner raised their hand. When the count reached majority, the new acting president announced the outcome in a single flat sentence that seemed to echo through the room. Nancy Pierce, removed from office, stripped of authority, pending legal review. She stood frozen behind her clipboard, her expression hollow. The room buzzed with subdued relief. Years of resentment exhaled in unspoken unity. For the first time, the homeowners had spoken louder than her rules. I didn't feel proud. I felt something slower, quieter. Justice settling into place like soil after heavy rain. When I left the meeting hall, night had fallen. The glow from their polished clubhouse lights reflected off puddles from an earlier drizzle. My yard waited at the end of the block, broken but mine again. Standing there in the dark, I thought about how control can't really hold without consent, how the illusion of authority only lasts until truth peers behind it. Nancy tried to make the neighborhood look perfect. Instead, she'd shown them how ugly control looks when it hides behind beauty. But even though she was gone, her fight wasn't over yet. People like her don't lose quietly. The next morning would bring the full storm. Investigations, news attention, and the meltdown that would mark her name forever. By morning, the fallout had already begun. The neighborhood message board filled with chatter before sunrise. Neighbors trading screenshots of invoices, emails, and photos from the night before. What had started as whispers turned into an uproar. The same streets that once echoed with garden gossip now buzzed with anger, bewilderment, and a strange sense of vindication. Nancy's empire had finally cracked, and the pieces were sharp. The HOA office, once her fortress of authority, became a field of chaos. People lined up with copies of their billing statements, demanding answers about unauthorized maintenance fees. Others combed through past notices, discovering discrepancies that suddenly made sense. Her beautification initiative wasn't the first time she'd siphoned off funds. It was just the largest. By noon, the county property management department had opened a review. An anonymous call, not mine, tipped them off to potential misuse of homeowner dues. But I didn't need to guess who made the call. Word spread that one of Nancy's own board members had reached out, hoping to avoid being implicated. When officials arrived, they carried stacks of subpoenas and questions she couldn't shrug off with a smile. The press arrived next. A small local paper published an article titled, "HOA President Faces Investigation Over Landscaping Scandal." Within hours, it was everywhere. Shared online by residents, then picked up by bigger outlets looking for another HOA gone rogue story. The comments section was a storm of people from other neighborhoods cheering for justice, each adding their own tale of petty tyranny. I avoided speaking publicly, even as my name circulated quietly as the homeowner who exposed it all. That spotlight didn't interest me. Watching truth move on its own was enough. But Nancy couldn't stand silence. She posted her response to the neighborhood board that afternoon. A rambling, defensive statement accusing a coordinated group of defamers of spreading lies. She insisted the landscaping fund had been a volunteer community project, the financial overlap a misunderstanding, and her removal a coup organized by discontented residents. Her post was long, her replies defensive, but no one believed her anymore. Screenshots of her business registration and her signature on the contracts were still everywhere. Receipts didn't lie even if she did. That night, council representatives arrived at the HOA office to seize records. The sound of a locksmith changing the door locks echoed down the street like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. Days passed and more came to light. The HOA's reserve fund, meant for emergencies, had been quietly drained to pay for landscape consulting and management fees listed under Nancy's hidden company. In total, she had skimmed nearly $40,000 over 2 years. The city's legal department took over from there. Investigations turned into charges, misappropriation, conflict of interest, and fraud. The news spread fast. Her name became public record. Her reputation, once bulletproof, shattered completely. Even people who used to fear her walked past her house in silence, heads low but eyes raised, watching the spectacle of someone who had built their life on control lose all of it in weeks. The HOA board resigned entirely. A community vote followed, this time honest. For the first time since the neighborhood was founded, residents gathered without tension. The laughter that once felt risky flowed freely now. They elected a temporary committee, ordinary neighbors, ready to rebuild without someone pretending perfection meant policing. As for Nancy, she moved quickly after that. Her house went on the market. The for sale sign stood crooked in the front lawn, its presence almost symbolic, a monument to misplaced ambition. On her last day in Brookdale, she avoided everyone. The moving truck loaded quietly before sunrise, but people still peeked through curtains, watching her go. The woman who once inspected every petal in every garden left without glancing at a single yard. When the truck turned the corner, someone began clapping. Started small, then spread. By the time the vehicle disappeared, half the block was outside, cheering into the fading morning light. It wasn't celebration. It was release. Later that evening, I walked through my yard again, trench lines still visible where her landscapers had ripped through it months before. The devastation was still there, but the quiet was different now. Not empty, peaceful. The HOA fell into temporary oversight by the city while reform committees formed. Residents divided sections of responsibility among themselves. Maintenance, budgeting, events. For the first time, every rule had a human reason behind it. The neighborhood finally looked alive again. But even as the air cleared, something still felt unfinished. I kept a copy of the investigation report, complete with date stamps and photos. Proof of what power does when left unchecked. Because even though Nancy was gone, her story had reached far beyond our small block. The video clips, the articles, the leaked financial documents, all of it together had made Brookdale infamous. And soon, that infamy would transform into something else entirely. A story that would change how HOAs everywhere operated. It didn't end here. It ended when people across the state started asking one question that Nancy had made necessary. Who watches the people in charge? Months passed, but Brookdale never truly went back to what it had been. The lawns grew wilder, softer, more personal. Yards sprouted vegetable patches, wind chimes, and mismatched flower beds. Without a president to dictate what beauty looked like, the neighborhood finally looked human again. It didn't happen overnight, but the fear faded. The same neighbors who once kept their heads down now smiled at one another. Fence lines that once felt like battle zones became boundaries of friendship. People borrowing tools, sharing seeds, talking across backyards. The tension had dissolved, replaced by something quietly revolutionary. Autonomy. And yet, the effects of Nancy's downfall reached far beyond our small circle of streets. The story, our story, had sparked something. The local newspaper updates turned into televised segments when the state inspector's office confirmed the scope of the fraud. What had started as an internal scandal became an example cited by communities across the state, proof of what happens when power in small spaces goes unchecked. By late spring, the city council introduced what they called the Homeowner Transparency Bill, a set of measures designed to regulate HOAs, mandating open access to budgets, recorded meetings, and the election process. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. People from other neighborhoods began reaching out. Families who'd been fined for harmless things. Residents punished for creativity or noncompliance. The so-called Brookdale case, that's what news anchors called it, gave them a voice. I never sought to become part of anything that big. I only wanted my garden back. But somehow, each interview I gave, every document I shared, helped shape something larger, a quiet rebellion against control disguised as community. Within a year, the bill passed. Suddenly, homeowners everywhere had the right to review financials without request delays. HOA presidents could no longer take unilateral action on cosmetic changes to private property. Every fine had to be documented, every decision transparent. The weight that once pressed down on neighborhoods like ours began to lift. In Brookdale, a new committee formed, a volunteer group called the Harmony Council. No titles, no elections, no power games. Just neighbors. They took over what the old HOA had destroyed. They handled upkeep through communication, not coercion. We even hosted what we called the Renewal Festival that summer. Tables lined with homegrown food, new saplings planted in the park, a display for every garden that bloomed freely. Someone painted a small wooden sign that hung at the entrance. Beauty belongs to everyone. When I stood on my porch that evening, looking at the crowd gathered under string lights and laughter floating over fences, It struck me that what Nancy had tried to control had become the opposite. A community she could never have built. My own garden thrived again. I rebuilt it slowly, piece by piece, restoring what had been ripped away. But I didn't try to make it perfect anymore. The uneven rows, the heritage seeds from neighbors, even the faded fence stayed as they were. Each imperfection reminded me that individuality didn't need permission. I kept one item from the ordeal, the metal tag from Nancy's landscapers, the one stuck in my yard after the destruction. I hung it in my shed as a quiet reminder of what happens when power runs unchecked. It sat beside the folder of documents I once carried into that fateful meeting, the proof that started everything. Sometimes people stop by to ask about the story they saw online. They expect bitterness or pride, but what they hear instead is something simpler. Peace costs nothing. Control costs everything. Nancy's name still floats around the internet occasionally, usually in cautionary articles about HOA scandals. She never came back, and she never apologized. But I don't think about her much anymore. Things far greater than her ambition grew in the space she left behind. Brookdale learned that order without empathy is just emptiness dressed up as progress. And beyond our fences and sidewalks, that message traveled. To lawmakers, to reporters, to every homeowner tired of being told what their home should be. It's strange how quickly power folds under truth, how easily one yard's tragedy can turn into change for thousands of others. And sometimes, when I step outside at dusk, watering my patchwork garden while fireflies scatter through the air, I think about how it all began. A week's vacation, a ruined yard, a reckless decision by one person who thought beauty meant control. But real beauty grew from what she destroyed. Because when people are allowed to shape their own spaces, their own lives, the result isn't chaos. It's freedom.